Hello and welcome to the Health Chat. I'm your host, Vicky, and today I'm joined by an educator, author and naturopath, as well as counsellor with over 30 years of experience, Mr. Mark Wells. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Vicky. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Now, I've known Mark for a good couple of years and I've worked very closely with you on those flower essence videos, which some of you may know about, and they do have quite a cult following actually. And cut to 12 months later, we did a flower essence video for highly sensitive people. I don't know if you remember that. That was in August of 2021. And I remember seeing how many clicks that particular video had. It just went viral. And I thought, wow, this is an area that people are really interested in. Afterwards, when we had finished the video, you were talking about how you're currently finishing writing a book on highly sensitive people. And I said, we have to do a podcast because it's going to be phenomenal. And I guess that this book, which I've got right here, is made for people who live with or don't understand HSPs, but are very curious to find out more about highly sensitive people. But it's also for highly sensitive people who want to truly understand and embrace the amazingness that they have to offer. Now, so having said that, Mark, you give us your interpretation of what an HSP is.
Well, you're looking at one for a start. I suppose the first thing is that they're very deep thinkers and deep feelers. So not much gets past them. They notice everything that's around them. That's the first thing. But that you need to expend a lot of energy if your brain's working that hard. It's not just concentrating on what's happening in front. They're aware of everything else that's going around. They're very contextual in their way they view things. So that can be a bit tiring, and that's why they need desperately need their time outs. And then they can come back and fire up and function really well. The other thing, it's 20% of the general population. I know as a practitioner, I would probably say it's more like 50% of the clients we get. And they tend to be drawn to perhaps less clinical approaches, situations where they can actually talk out how they feel, where they don't feel pressured for time, and they're able to sort of relax and express how they feel and what's happening with them. That's the thing they know. But I think the important thing is that they notice things. They're very aware. They've got an incredible amount to offer to the world and to friends and colleagues, but they won't necessarily be the forceful, pushing their ideas, loud type of person. It's just not their way. They're certainly not, they go a long way to avoid confrontation, etc. Just because they feel it so intensely. Anyone else's feelings, anyone else's, negativity towards them. But I suppose as the book is about, yes, so people can appreciate, so highly sensitive people can become more appreciative of themselves and realise they're part of a big community, if you like, but also for less sensitive people to realise, oh, I didn't realise we had such a resource there in our work, or in my family, I really didn't read my child or didn't read my partner as well as I could, and I've missed something there and misunderstood some of the messages I was getting. So that's what the book's about, and that's what this podcast is about, hopefully to explain a bit more about it to people.
So a highly sensitive person is not someone that's just sensitive to what's the way someone looks at them or someone says about them, but it's also their complete environment as well, which you discuss in the book.
Yeah, well, they are. Look, they are. In terms of the way people look at them and things like that, they'll pick up on that. They pick up very much on the things that aren't said in their environment, but they will notice other things going on around them. And that can be sometimes a bit overwhelming, particularly if they're tiring, taking in all that information. And that's why I talk about how they need these sort of timeouts, these times to just sort of shut down on all the sensory input that's around them, have a bit of a break from it, come back out there into the world. And the world today is it's doing everything to attract their attention. And for highly sensitive people, they're, they may not want to, but they're absorbing all of that. And it does, they're a bit like the old, psychic sponge. They will pick up on everything. And they will pick up on people's intention. Going back to what you're saying about looking at them, I even make a recommendation in the book that if you're at work, if you want to assess your highly sensitive person, don't try the odd, put them out the front, put the pressure on them, look at them, do everything to put them off, because you will, because they'll absorb that and they won't perform at their best. Find other ways of measuring, their contribution and how they can contribute and their value, and you will find it. But as I said, I look, personally with public speaking, I used to, I still don't find it the easiest thing, but and particularly if I'm in a new room, new situation, new hall, talking to people, it's not about a lack of confidence with my knowledge or being able to answer questions or etc. It is purely being overwhelmed by the situation. And I have done a lot of lecturing over the years, and usually by the second or third lecture, I'm totally relaxed and I can perform because I'm just familiar with the surroundings and the people. But people could perhaps misconstrue, and I was always told, "Oh, Mark, you know so much about it. Why are you lacking confidence? It's a self-esteem," and it's nothing to do with self-esteem or anything like that. It was purely just being overwhelmed by a new situation and everything that was there.
Yeah, and I guess there is a misconception that even I had, was that only introverts can be highly sensitive.
Yeah.
But there is definitely a portion of people that are extroverts who are highly sensitive.
Yeah, well, the research is, well supported that probably about two-thirds are a little bit more are introverts, but there is this 30% that are extroverts. And this was it's been, supported with research, but it was picked up by Carl Jung. The whole idea of a sensitive person really comes from Carl Jung, the psychotherapist from some years back. And he spoke of these sensitive people that had been called shy, had been called timid. But he noticed a group, that were in that sort of presenting that way, but self-esteem was good. It was okay, and he couldn't, and it didn't make sense, and it wasn't really about a lack of confidence or in themselves. But he did identify that about the majority are introverts, but you've got this sort of 30% or a third that are extroverts, and of course that's a little bit more difficult. Because if you're extroverted, yes, you want to be out there. You want to be out there making a noise. You want to be in the hustle and bustle. You want to be in the crowd. You want to be at the party. But if you're highly sensitive, you're going to be worn out in no time. So you need, sort of need to retreat. And look, it can be great, but the thing is, you need to understand yourself. And once you understand, look, I have a need to be out there, you balance your life with the times when you're not out there.
Yeah, I can identify that in my daughter, to be honest. She's not an introvert. She's more of an extrovert than an introvert, but she comes across as an introvert because she's quite sensitive. But she does want to be out there. She does want to experience and everything. But it's the sudden changes that affect her. Whereas if she's familiar, it's not a problem.
No, that's right. I mean, and I say with because highly sensitive people notice everything. It's like even familiar things can be new because they'll notice the slightest change. It's much better to be in a familiar surrounding, but you can be sure that the highly sensitive person will go, "What's that doing there?" Or what have you changed? Or what's happened here? Because they notice the nuances.
They do.
Yeah.
And I guess that's really interesting because in the first, I think it's the first chapter actually, maybe it's the first few pages, you give this great analogy between these two goats. That one is an HSP or, a highly sensitive goat, maybe an HSG, and the other one is not, and how we need both types to survive, because the one that is the sensitive goat can hear, a snap or a crack or a change of wind, but the other one who is not sensitive has the guts to go out and find the food. That was That was really good because it helped me understand the difference, but I think it'd be good for the listeners to hear you speak about that, to give them a better idea.
And I know you didn't mean it, but I'm going to pick you up, notice the nuance there, and said the one that had the guts to go out there. I'd probably say more it was they didn't think about it.
True.
And they're just out there. I mean, it is a great example because of how we need both. We need people who are going to venture out there, take the risks. But we also need these other people who are a little bit more cautious to say, listen, if you go out there, watch out for this, this and this. And as I said, that goat who just fires out there, he can see some food or she can see some food. They're going to head out there and enjoy the food, but they do have that risk that there's a lion around the bend that the other goat would have noticed. So it balances out, and there's heaps of research. There's about 100 species of animals that have been thoroughly researched in regards this high sensitivity. And the same figure comes up, this sort of 1 in 5, 20%. But they also say that part of the species survival is getting the balance between the two. And, I think we humans can, and hopefully with this book, we humans can start to appreciate that, because there's no doubt that the loud, forceful, and we see that in the world today, the loud, forceful people, they get the notice, and often get the power in that sense. But if we could get that balance right, we will be better off as a species, human beings.
So how can we recognise an HSP, Mark? What are some of their key characteristics?
Well, I think, if you're in a group of friends, they're not going to be the ones jumping up and down and yelling and screaming initially. They may be the ones just sort of sitting back a bit from in the group. And you may, if they may not come into figure with things until you're talking about something that's got a bit of depth. And I don't mean to be, ridicule anyone who talks a bit of the everyday stuff, talks about the weather. But that's really tiresome for highly sensitive people, to talk in a very shallow way and all that. They'll be well-mannered, they'll do all that, but they'd rather talk about things that have a bit of depth and have a bit of meaning. There's a reason. So they may not, at a party, it may be sort of later, when everyone sort of calms down and we're sort of mingling more, you'll get to chat with a highly sensitive person, and you'll find it's probably the most interesting chat you had all night, if I might say. But because they'd rather talk about something with a bit of meat on it and, something in depth. And as I said, they do find it a bit tiresome just to, carry on about nothing. I'm not saying they don't have a sense of humour. They can have fun. Really good sense of humour. A lot of highly sensitive people have got very dry sense of humour. But that's what you'll notice. So they're not going to be loud and in your face. That's the first thing. Yeah. They may be sort of, standing back a bit. And also, it's going to, because they do feel things very deeply, it won't take a lot for them to perhaps be put off by something that's said in the group. And that's going to mean perhaps they might retreat a little bit more. So I think, I suppose that's one way of noticing it. Yeah, but I mean, look, highly sensitive people can still perform well in their job. So, if they have to be outgoing, if they have to be up the front and assertive in certain situations, if that's their job, they'll learn ways to do that. But it might be more that sort of quiet assertiveness, very strong presence. Even if they're not saying anything, most highly sensitive people, you'll sort of, feel they're around because they're thinking deeply. The engine room's certainly churning over. So you notice they do have a presence, even though it might not be a loud verbal presence.
It's interesting that you talk about the job, like they can sort of adapt to what is required of their work, because I know I'm very close to someone who happens to be an HSP, but part of their work is they have to be, alert and upbeat and all these things, but I do find that they need a real good switch off. So when they finish, it's just complete downtime because they need that recharge. Even though that person is not an introvert, they're probably an extrovert, but they do need the recharge.
Oh, it does. It does expend a lot of energy. They'll do it, so they need that break. Yeah.
So let's move to the HSP child, because this chapter was probably the one that I was looking forward to the most. And I guess when you fall in love with someone and you have a relationship, that person may be an HSP, but they've learnt to adapt through their life how to handle certain situations. And so the HSP is not, that part of them is not as pronounced, right? It's not as profound. Yeah. But when you become the parent of an HSP and someone who's not one themselves, it can be, for me, I'm not going to say disappointing, but probably a little bit frustrating, because I was like, well, come on, let's go and talk to this person. Let's have a play date. And I struggled with that a bit, right? Because I didn't understand this whole term. And people would look at my child and say, oh, she's shy. Why is she so shy? And that's how it could come across to a parent of an HSP. But, I quickly learned, no, that's not shyness, that's cautiousness, that's evaluation. And so I was hoping you could take us through some of the ways that we can parent a highly sensitive child, because this was brilliant for me.
Yeah, well, look, for sure. And I think I was fortunate with both my children are reasonably sensitive, but one in particular, very similar to myself, and that's my daughter. So I could recognise those things. It probably filled me with fear, actually, but noticing that there's so much that's going to be going on for her. And I think that's what you have to look for, that, what's going on superficially, there'll be a lot underneath. And I think in any good parenting, you want to find out what are the emotions underneath. And with all children, there's levels of emotion, and it's always better if you can get to the ones underneath the surface. But I think even more so for HSPs, to give them, first of all, to give them the space to actually express that. Pick your times. I think in a chat with yourself, it was a really good example. When your HSP child's finished the school day, they're tired. And you say, oh, how'd it go? All that sort of stuff. They probably don't want to talk. They just want to, shut everything down for a while, perhaps allow them to go to their room. They're not being rude. They're just reevaluating. They're just rebooting, if you like, and they'll come out and then they'll perhaps volunteer what's happening for them. And I think that's a real thing. It's about creating the space for them. And look, all kids are different, and you might think, look, there may be more time and energy needed for that. It doesn't mean you're going to neglect your other child or children, but the rewards would be great, and the dynamic in the family would be fantastic if you just give them the space to do that. And I think that becomes easier, and they learn how they can find space themselves to express themselves in the dynamic of the family. So I think it is about, not pushing. If there's a lot going on, particularly if they're tired, just give them that settling time. And I've always, one of the common things I say to a lot of my clients or parents of the highly sensitive children is, don't worry if they go to their room. That's fine. Just think, oh, they've gone to their room. They're recharging. That's fantastic. It's like watching them have a beautiful, healthy meal. They're recharging. They'll come back and they'll talk to you. So I think, look, it's about giving them space. Once you I think recognizing it's the good thing. And look, because they are so aware, highly sensitive people, and particularly children, they pick up on good intention. So even if you stuff it up or feel as though you're not getting it right, the highly sensitive kid picks up on good intention, and they will know that it's where it's coming from and why the person's doing it. just as quick as they will pick up something negative or someone who's doing something, that's not genuine. So I think that's the thing too. That's always the safety valve. If you think, oh, I'm not getting it right here. But I think it's just learning. It's recognising that, particularly if you're not a sensitive, highly sensitive person yourself, recognise, well, they're going to perceive the world a little bit differently to me. They're going to experience it a little bit differently. And the more I can understand that, the more we can get each other involved.
That's a really good point, that they need their time, because I can see with my eldest daughter, she does need that time to recharge. And her recharge is like crocheting. She likes to crochet, and she does these magnificent and elaborate designs. And, she'll make a vest or she'll make a cap or whatever it is, but it's just her switch off. And then I have my other child who has taught herself how to play the ukulele because she likes music. That's her downtime. So, yeah, I can see that space is required. And you're right, they come back ready to party again. It's kind of interesting to watch.
Exactly. Can I just elaborate on that too? The space is really important. I was the youngest of 4 boys, and I mentioned it in the book because there was another client I was talking about who had managed to find his space throughout life, from at home right through to his work. And it was always finding a little niche where he could survive, come out and do his work and then go back and back to his cave. And I remember as a youngster, I was sharing the room, and the older brothers didn't want me around or something, and I was put out towards the veranda in the back. And anyone might superficially say, "Oh, you poor thing, you were put out there in the back there." It was the best thing that ever happened because I had my space, and that was so important. And I got on much better with the family. Well, I wasn't such a pain in the butt. Yeah. I should say that about kids too. And when I was a pain in the butt, the oversensitivity is also around overreactivity. So we can confuse highly sensitive kids, particularly in the even the attention deficit area, or at school they might be those hyper, if you like, active kids. But it's because they're just so reactive. They react to everything. And noises, as you say, noisy environments will either make a highly sensitive person close right down or just want to get away. But it may, in some, and I think perhaps in some of young male boys, more because of the, how would you say, stereotypically for that gender, the behaviour, perhaps. They'd be more reactive and it would be a more of a sort of out there extroverted sort of behaviour. But underneath there can be this, very strong sensitivity, but it's just they're so reactive to everything around them.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question. You speak about autism in the book and how there are quite significant similarities between autism and a highly sensitive child. And I could probably see how, and you do take us through a journey of such patient and how some children may be misdiagnosed or misunderstood in this area, and they're not really autistic, but maybe highly sensitive.
Yeah, and look, I'm not saying I'm an absolute expert in the field, but I am, academically trained in there as well. But I think the sensitivity, that high sensitivity, can be confused a bit, and particularly, and there's a lot of psychologists out there, and I'm not denigrating them all, but they wonder what's the point of this, because if it's not a condition, I don't have a treatment for it. If it's not an anxiety disorder, it's not something there. So how do I treat sensitivity? And of course you don't. It's a trait. You just be aware of it and work with it. But back to the autistic side, look, let's take a simple example. Looking in someone's eyes, a lot of autistic kids are seen as they can't do that. And that is part of their sensitivity, because it's a bit like in animals, if you stare at animals, it's a threat. It's quite an intimidating stance. I know as a youngster, that was one thing I had to get used to. Just even staring in people in their eyes. And someone say, "What's wrong? You don't like looking at us in the eye?" Well, it's not because they're on the autism spectrum or anything like that. They're just quite sensitive. And they find that, particularly if they're talking to an adult who's giving them a nice glare. So little things like that, the sensitivity that's there and some of the behaviours of the child as a result of that sensitivity could be misinterpreted. And I think now, it's great that we're aware that there are highly functioning people out there who are at the one end of that autism spectrum, which could be easily confused with someone who's just really highly sensitive. And I think just to be aware of that. And look, if I could go a little bit further there, that there's no doubt that highly sensitive people are more prone in general to anxiety and perhaps depression. Now, but you can treat that, but if you don't treat that, if you don't take into account the sensitivity, they'll always, the anxiety levels, all these sort of things will come back. And if I could say one thing about that, it's interesting, if a highly sensitive child has a very positive upbringing, they are not necessarily more likely to become depressed or have anxiety disorders, than the average in the average population. However, if a highly sensitive child is brought up in a very negative, unsupportive environment, they will be more prone than the less sensitive child to develop later things like anxiety and depression and other mental illness.
And I guess you'd see a lot of these in practice, Mark, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, in my practice, I think just being a naturopath and counsellor, I think people coming to me as an acknowledgement that they're trying to do something, particularly if they bring their children, there's an acknowledgement that there's something there that they're not doing as well as they'd like to do. So that's a good intent. And that's, to me, part of a positive upbringing. And, but you do see that, and you've got to teach, and you've often it might be the partner that's not there that needs to learn they're not approaching the child properly. It might be the classical, I don't think you were like this, but it might be the classical, why don't they just toughen up, and all those sort of things, which is not going to help.
No.
And as Carl Jung said, if you don't, even if you can force that child to be so-called tougher or put on a bravado or some way do that, they will suffer as a consequence until they start really expressing who they genuinely are.
And that's where your book works really well. It does help people like myself who are not HSPs to understand it and to accommodate better, to give that child a loving and supportive environment for them to be at their best potential. I've got to say that was really good for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I also love how you explain the physical manifestations of diseases, like, so mainly skin-related diseases, or a child that's playing up or whatever it is as an outlet. And I guess a highly sensitive child may display these ways, with a rash or a tummy ache or whatever it is. That was quite important. So I think it'd be good for our listeners to hear you talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'll start from the point that I've always been interested in the body-mind. And I always say, look, if someone's been diagnosed with a particular ailment, that ailment's on all levels. There'll be an aspect of that that's on the mental or emotional level as well as the physical.
Yeah.
I don't see people as just, it's either, a physical thing or it's either a mental thing. I look more from a holistic point of view. So if you start from that vantage point, you can realise, well, sensitivity is going to be expressed in this being, in this human being. And if there's a lot of sensitivity in the area of, food intolerances, environmental intolerances, etc., you may not see it as expressed as much on the mental and emotional level, and vice versa. So it's a matter of, I suppose, adding up, that adds up to a very sensitive person. And And sometimes, I even talk about some people in there that if they've not had an opportunity because of their upbringing, I talk about a lady in particular who, was learning and sort of enjoying bringing up another highly sensitive child in a different way to the way she was. It seemed that the way it was expressed in her childhood was more through allergies and becoming sick as a consequence. Because she did get at least the understanding, the nurturing, and the TLC in that way. But I suppose that's it. That this person's very sensitive, but it wasn't an environment to see that expressed. In fact, it was it was either ridiculed or wasn't allowed. There was no space given, so it manifested in another way. And I think that's the way I look at the human being in that sort of holistic view. And if you're looking in that way, you may well see that it's expressed in one area and not so much in the other, and vice versa. Going a little bit further, I talk about even gut health, and gut health's such a huge thing now, whether it's in the complementary medicine or conventional mainstream medicine. Now we talk about bowel flora and all that. But once again, going back to what I say, if we're having trouble digesting life, we can't assimilate everything. We're getting overwhelmed. That will reflect in our gut. It won't digest things as well. And I talk about how, look, if you can, the best thing for a highly sensitive person if they want to eat, it's better for anyone to be relaxed and calm and just be with their food or whatever. But more than ever for highly sensitive people, they're not going to die if they're feeling uncomfortable, whether it's with the people they're at the dinner table or whether it's just the cafe environment. I've found my perfect cafe. It's just never too loud and make great coffee. But it makes all the difference. And as much as I love cafes, I don't like going to new ones because it takes me a while to go there, so I don't digest it as well. But that's what I mean. They'll be very sensitive to their environment. So as much as possible for highly sensitive people, if they're going to eat or have things, make sure it's in a nice, calming environment. I even talk about a child in the book that tended to react to the food additives and the colourings and the sugar more if the child went with the parents to a noisy cafe, whereas they tolerated some of those things much better when they were quietly sitting at home, and the behaviour reflected that, which was another interesting thing there. Yeah.
Very interesting. All right, so now let's shift to the cultural influences. And I guess there's a difference in the way HSPs are treated around the world. And there's probably a belief that there are more HSPs in one culture and not another.
Well, I'll give the extreme example, and again, I'm not being judgmental here, but just different people, appreciate different things. We could probably use America and Japan. Japan is sort of recognised as being a place where sensitive people, highly sensitive people, are really appreciated and respected. The highly sensitive child at school is the one that's, people go to, is the one that's really appreciated. Whereas perhaps, and look, there'll be exceptions to the rule. If you think of the American culture or more the Western culture, it'll be the outstanding, outspoken, one that's doing the obvious funny or performing. Will be the one that everyone will gravitate to. So there's more that individual sort of thing, whereas the individual is certainly celebrated in the American culture, whereas in Japan it's more the whole context of things. And they almost like it if people blend in and they don't sort of stand out and distract from the whole. That makes sense. But and they've done research on this, and they've just they did some research between American students and Japanese students, and they showed pictures, and they recorded the sort of reactions, what people remembered of those pictures. And the American students would notice, oh, there was a man with a gun, or they were looking at the individual or particular things in that picture. Whereas the Japanese students were looking, oh, it's spring. It looks as though it's going to rain. There's some people in it. Yeah, there's a man that, they would see the whole context. But going a bit deeper, they then looked at, and this was quite a big, they've done a fair bit of research, different research papers, and on a couple of them, they've actually compared the HSPs in both. And they said there was very little difference between what the HSPs observed, meaning that, the implications are that highly sensitive people don't get as influenced by culture, which means when they're out there, they're not necessarily as pressured as much with peer group pressure and things like that, perhaps as teenagers and things like that, because they think deeply about things. And if they're going to make a decision to do something, they're not going to just do it because everyone else is doing it.
Mm-hmm.
They'll do it because, no, that's what I want to do. If they do it for the other reason, they're not going to be happy because they haven't thought it. It's like their work. It's got to have meaning. I don't think I've got it in the book. So I hate to admit this, but when I was about 6, 7 years of age, I remember having a bit of an argument with my mother, and I said, "Why did you have me?" And she goes, "Oh, sorry, what, Mark?" And I said, "Well, why did you have me?" "Oh, I don't, that's what people do." And I said, "Well, that's the silliest answer I've ever heard." Anyway, I was a bit of a pain in those days, but that was me as a highly sensitive people saying, well, why did you, is that why you do it? Just because everyone else does. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't conform or follow things, but highly sensitive people do think it through. So they're not just going to follow what's, the latest trend and they're going to be less influenced by culture.
So let me ask this question, because this is, as I was reading the book, this really did come to my mind in this particular chapter. So I was brought up in a culture where, because I'm first generation Australian, but the culture in not just our house, but as a country as a whole, is always the kindness and thinking about how others would feel. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like emotional intelligence is regarded very highly as part of our culture, and, something that I try to instill in the kids as well. And then I find that in other cultures, it's not a big deal. It's all self-driven. And is there some portion of emotional intelligence, even though I'm not highly sensitive, like I said, I've taken the test and I failed, but I feel I do have a higher emotional intelligence. How does EQ match up with HSP? What's the relationship?
Oh, yeah, look, and, the emotional intelligence is something that, yes, highly sensitive people have. They're almost too empathetic in a sense. They show empathy. It's very easy. Now, but this is the thing with yourself. You wouldn't be talking about this. You wouldn't be so driven to understand your daughter if you didn't have some emotional intelligence. And I'm not saying that highly sensitive people can't have that, but less sensitive people can't have it. But highly sensitive people have got it in bucket loads,
right.
and it probably can be a bit of a problem sometimes because it's sort of their Achilles heel. They can be very intuitive, notice the nuances. I take my own example as it helps me in my practice as a naturopath and counsellor to have empathy, to be able to walk a mile in someone's shoes and understand it. But that also can be, your Achilles heel. It can drain you like anything.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we have some nice remedies to help in that sense. Some nice natural remedies. That might be something with yourself, that you have great emotional intelligence and you can show empathy, but maybe you can do that without being as vulnerable as someone like myself, or potentially overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
And I think this is the thing that where I talk about timeouts for highly sensitive people, but I also talk about protecting yourself, learning to know what situations are just not good for you, because you absorb it, and they will absorb they will pick up on the feelings of others. It's an interesting thing, you know, and I've had a lot of highly sensitive people say this, and I understand it, that they're with groups of people and someone might be saying something offensive to someone else, but almost the highly sensitive person that's sitting at the other end of the table is just, or probably just as much offended as the one being who copped the offensive remark. And it's very difficult to separate yourself from that. And they make good friends because they're going to be, you know, they are going to be, well, most of the time they're going to be nice. They can get a bit weary sometimes, highly sensitive people, and you don't want to be on the end of some of their irritability because they do notice things, so they'll certainly know what to say.
They're very deep as well, I find.
Yeah.
The thoughts are very deep, probably even as they get older. And, you know, it goes back to what you're talking about with depression and anxiety. I can see how it runs very, very deep for them. But
just on that point, and that's where we need, you know, a lot of highly sensitive people also need to realise, come on, lighten up. You know, there'll be times when, you want to think deeply about things. It's like I love my work and it's a very meaningful one, and I do think deeply about it with the clients and stuff. But I still have to watch my footy, and I have to do things that are brain numbing, you know, that don't require that, to get that balance, or just meditate or things like that. So yeah.
There is another question I want to ask, but I just want to go back to what you said, something brain numbing. So is there then, if we think about what brain numbs or what can take the edge off, are HSPs more susceptible to addiction or addictive behaviours?
Look, I say it honestly in the books, and I've said it honestly to my kids who've got through their teens. I think from about 15 to 25, and I played a lot of sport, and hung around with people that were fairly out there, volatile. I'd do my, you know, Saturday nights out till all hours. And the reason I could do it is because I was drinking. And would be classed now as a binge drinker. I mean, I didn't drink during the week, but I would drink a lot. And that was how I stayed out, because it numbed me. And I was talking to someone the other day that, you know, if I went back there and I wasn't drinking, I would have been home at 7:30 on Saturday night when I was 22. But drinking sort of gave me an artificial energy, but it numbed. So I could sort of, you know, stay out there and not get so overwhelmed. But then, you know, I was useless Sunday, and you know, I mean, you pay for it. And I think too, you can put yourself in situations, and talking about if there are addictions, if you're drinking too much, you can put yourself in situations, male or female, that are traumatic. But you may not feel that because you're numb to it, but you will pay the consequences.
Very interesting. That's something, I guess, as a parent you can look out for your child if you start to see these unusual behaviours, or the drinking, or the drug abuse, or whatever it is. That I think it's probably a good switch for parents to think, oh, maybe I need to readjust my parenting.
And even understanding why they're doing it, because I know with myself, it wasn't like I craved a drink. You know, there's a difference between some addictions, you know, they're really craving it, their body's screaming out. I mean, if you become dependent on it, it will, but I wasn't craving alcohol, but I used it, if you like, to numb me in certain situations. So I think, once again, if your teenage child or late teens is having a bit of difficulty with any substance and abusing it, it's to get to say, well, why are you having it? You know, what's there? You'll get a better understanding.
And finally, let's discuss your successful naturopathic intervention, right? And I realise that Western medicine practice is probably not in depth or nurturing enough, and maybe HSPs have sought that type of intervention. But I want to know why they choose complementary or traditional medicine, and what are your go-tos when you deal with HSPs? Because I know you're very successful in this area. Like, all my friends say, give me Mark Wells' number. Give me Mark Wells' number. So what are your go-tos?
Well, thank you. Look, I might use my own example. When I was 20, I used to get migraines. And you've just heard that I used to drink a lot on weekends. And that was may had some impact on the fact that I'd often get the migraines Monday night or Tuesday. However, when I cleaned up my life, I would still get them. But I remember at about 20 or so, going to a doctor, and then I was sent to a specialist I think I was diagnosed with depression, but I wanted something for the migraines. And I was offered these experimental things or these painkillers. And I'm going, yeah, but I want to get rid of them. Well, what's causing these? And they said, well, when you drink or when you eat chocolate or no, but I realised is, well, they're the triggers, but they're not the reason I get migraines. So again, it's this depth. I wanted to get to, well, why am I getting it? There's more to this. So there was a bit of a dissatisfaction there. You know, that crept in then. Well, they haven't got the answer for me. And, you know, and often I would feel, you know, what am I going to do in 5 minutes anyway, in a consultation. So a lot of people find they go there, they have a deep understanding of themselves. And in a sense, I won't say it's disrespected, but there's no time for the doctor to follow up on that deep understanding, because they do know a lot about themselves and they've got a lot to offer. Where if they come to a naturopath or particularly a homeopath, for example, and I've used a lot of homeopathy, we love all that. We want all that information. It gives us the full picture, and highly sensitive people can certainly give that to us. And of course, they feel heard. Whereas they're not going to feel heard in a very clinical condition. They feel under the pump, under pressure, they get overwhelmed. Whatever comes out is going to be not very good or very articulate, and they'll be lumped, oh, this person's got neurosis or something like that, or anxiety or whatever, which they probably have to a degree, but they will want time and space, as I keep saying, to be able to elaborate on how they feel, what's going on. So the complementary medicine where they get an opportunity to do that's going to be appealing, as distinct from a very clinical situation. The other thing is too that as I said before, with some psychologists, but particularly those that might be predominantly doing cognitive behaviour therapy, CBT, they need to sort of say, they need a diagnosis, and then they can work with that very well. There's no way with most HSPs, whatever they're elaborating on or talking about to the GP, I don't know which box to put them in. Or even if they did understand, well, this person's really sensitive, what are we going to give them?
Yeah.
Well, really, the only options you've got in a medical thing is similar to what we said about alcohol, some way of numbing it. And that could be, I'm sure and I know there's a lot of highly sensitive people that are on antidepressants, because it does numb things down and, if you like, manage things to an extent, but it's not the answer. And it's certainly not the answer for a lot of highly sensitive people. So they are drawn to that. Now, the other thing about it too, you know, pharmaceutical drugs are quite potent things, and often a highly sensitive person will need half the dose. So they may have already had a reaction to the normal dose. They're too sensitive. So coming across to perhaps more complementary medicines where you are going to get the more subtle medicines, such as homeopathy or flower essences, and even herbs, certainly the way I use herbs in small quantities and things like that, they will take that and they won't react to that. It'll be much more easily assimilated. And they'll respond very well. They're the best responders. You know, they're very subtle in a sense, and they'll respond to the subtle therapies. So you've got the tools for them as well as the time and the space for them to elaborate on how they are and how they're going and what's happening with their health, and use their knowledge. Now, as far as specific things, I do talk about one specific thing in the book, and that's what's called the Yarrow Environmental Solution, the YES formula, which has 5 flower essences in it, and they're all very protective ones, emotional boundaries, you know, physical boundaries. And I know you know some people who use it all the time. I use it all the time as well in my own practice. But I think in general, flower essences, homeopathic medicines, are marvellous remedies for highly sensitive people. And because they are sensitive, you can actually help their sensitivity. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things you look at I won't go too much into it in homeopathy. You will go at what potency you're going to give the person a particular remedy. You will take into account, their susceptibility, but you take into account their sensitivity. So once again, the highly sensitive person gets an opportunity to have all bases covered, and get a sense that they're being looked after, and it makes sense to them and they understand it. So those remedies, of course, herbs and vitamins too. But again, even there, I'll give you the example of vitamin B. I preferred the old doses when they used to have just a little tiny 5 milligrams. Some people thrive on the larger doses, but I find that personally would be overstimulating for me. And there's a few remedies out there that have just got low dose. So once again, that's about the sensitivity. So even with vitamins and herbs, you need to take that into account, the person's sensitivity and how they'll react to those. And, I've had a lot of clients where I've thought it'd be fine, but I've even, I've had to half the dose. I've had to 1/10 of the dose, and that they were comfortable with that, and they, would work with that. So there's more of an opportunity to be flexible, to treat the individual, obviously in a lot of, the alternative or complementary therapies.
Thank you so much for your time, Mark. I'm sure everybody that's listening can identify quite a few people in their lives that are HSPs, because you've taken us through a wonderful journey. And the book, The Gift of High Sensitivity, is available now. I will put Mark's details and the book details all down below if you'd like to get in contact with Mark. Again, thank you so much for your time, Mark. It's always a pleasure. I always look forward to catching up with you, and I learn so much every time we discuss things. You're a wealth of information.
Oh, thank you, Vicky. I learn stuff myself too, with the questions you ask and the everything else. So thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the book, people.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.